They wanted human slaves. Instead, they accidentally created the galaxy's greatest horror. The chain around my wrist was not tight enough. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the smell of the ship, which was something like burned copper mixed with engine oil. Not the sound of 112 other people breathing in the dark around me. Not even the cold, which settled into the metal floor of the cargo hold and worked its way up through the thin fabric of my uniform until my bones ached with it. No. The first thing I noticed, the first useful thing, was that whoever had locked these restraints had not accounted for the fact that I had broken my left wrist twice in my life, and that the joint was slightly narrower than it should have been. My name is Ilara Voss. I was 31 years old when they took me. I had been a strike commander in the United Space Exploration Force for 6 years, and before that, I had spent 4 years in deep-range survey operations, which mostly involved floating alone in a small ship for months at a time, with nothing but star charts and silence. People who do that kind of work learn certain things. They learn to be patient. They learn to be very, very observant. And they learn that the most important information is almost always the thing that nobody bothered to hide, because nobody thought it mattered. The chain was not tight enough. That mattered. I did not move. I sat with my back against the cold hull, and I looked around the hold without turning my head, using only my eyes, letting my vision adjust to the dim blue light that came from a strip along the ceiling. I counted people, 112, including myself. I counted chains. Each person had one wrist locked to a floor ring. I counted floor rings. There were more rings than people, which told me the hold had been designed for a larger load, which told me we were either less valuable than expected, or this was a collection run, not a full shipment. I counted cameras. 3. One at each end of the hold and one above the single door. The cameras had fixed positions, no visible pivot joints, which meant they covered set angles and nothing more. There were gaps. There were always gaps. The door opened. He was tall. That was the first thing you noticed about the Ketharan, at least the ones who worked the transport ships. They were tall in the way that a structure is tall, not a living thing. Their bodies were gray-green and scaled, with 4 arms arranged in 2 pairs, the upper set longer and ending in 4-fingered hands, the lower set shorter, and used mostly for balance and carrying. Their heads were narrow, with eyes positioned on the sides like a bird, giving them a wide field of vision. They could not look directly forward the way humans could, which meant a Ketharan facing you was actually looking at 2 separate things at once, one eye on you, and one on something behind you. This one walked slowly through the hold, holding a thin silver rod in his upper right hand. He tapped it against his lower palm as he walked, not threatening, not yet, testing. He was reading us, trying to decide what he had bought. He stopped in front of a man sitting 3 people to my left. I recognized the man, even in the dark. His name was Callum Price. He had been the lead xenobiologist on our survey mission, which meant he was almost certainly the most educated person in this hold and, at this particular moment, that education was doing him no good at all. He was shaking. Not from cold, from fear, the kind of fear that takes you over completely and leaves nothing behind. The Ketharan guard reached down and put one long gray finger under Callum's chin, lifting his face to the light. He studied him. Then he made a sound, low and clicking, like stones knocking together deep in a riverbed. A translation chip in the base of my skull converted it. Soft, the chip told me. Fragile. This batch is ideal for the deep extraction work. He was pleased. He moved on down the line, tapping his rod, reading faces the way a buyer reads livestock. He passed me without stopping. I kept my eyes forward, my breathing even, my face empty, not blank with fear, empty with thought. He did not notice the difference. Most people never did. When the door closed again, the hold returned to near silence. Someone was crying softly to my right. Several people had their heads down. I understood. The shock of capture is a physical thing. It sits in your chest like a stone, and it makes everything feel slow and impossible. I had felt it once, years ago, when my survey ship had lost engine power in deep range, and I had spent 11 days drifting before a rescue beacon caught a passing freighter's sensors. That feeling of helplessness, of being completely outside your own control, it is one of the worst things a human being can experience. But here is what I had learned in those 11 days of drifting. Helplessness is a feeling, not a fact. The feeling is very convincing. The feeling wants you to believe that there is nothing to be done, no point in trying, no path forward. The feeling lies. I moved my left hand slowly, feeling the exact point where the cuff sat against the narrow part of my wrist. I was not going to free myself today. Today I needed to understand the ship, but I filed the information away with the same care I gave everything else I stored. Every small fact was a tool. You never knew which tool you were going to need. Callum had lifted his head. He was looking at me now. Even in the poor light I could see the question in his eyes. I gave him a very small nod. Not reassurance. Acknowledgement. I see you. I am still here. We are still thinking. He exhaled. Some of the shaking stopped. Over the following hours, which I measured by the change cycles of the ceiling light strip, I learned everything I could without making a single move that would draw the cameras. The ventilation system ran along the port wall. The hum changed pitch every 40 minutes or so, which suggested a cleaning cycle, which suggested it was filterable air, not synthesized, which meant this ship operated in systems with breathable atmosphere, rather than deep void. The floor vibration pattern told me we were moving at mid-range thrust, not maximum, which meant either they were conserving fuel or they had time. The guard rotation was every 60 minutes, always 2 guards, never more, which meant they were not afraid of us. That last part was important. That was information they had given us without knowing it. They were not afraid of us. They should have been paying more attention to what they were not afraid of. On the second day, I spoke to Callum, quietly, without moving, letting my voice carry just the few feet between us. I asked him what he knew about the Ketharan. He was, after all, the xenobiologist. He knew things I did not. He told me, in a low, careful voice, that the Ketharan had been collecting sentient species for over 3,000 years. They had a system. They called it the ordering. Species were ranked by productivity, compliance, and what they called biological efficiency, which was essentially how much work you could extract from a body before it stopped functioning. The most valuable slave species were the ones who were strong enough to work hard, but not clever enough to make trouble. The Ketharan had become very good at reading which category a new species would fall into. Where do they think we fall? I asked. They scanned us during capture, Callum said. Based on our biology, our muscle density, our apparent social structure during the ambush, they've categorized us as a Tier 3 labor species, good for extraction work, too fearful to organize. Too fearful, I repeated. That's what their assessment said. I saw it on the guard's datapad when he leaned over me. I read Ketharan's script. Spent 2 years on their border worlds before the mission. I looked at him. You read their language, and you did not tell anyone? I just told you. I almost smiled. Callum, from this point forward you tell me everything you see on any screen, any pad, any surface that carries text, everything. You have a plan. I have the beginning of one, I said. Plans grow. Right now I need information more than anything else. He nodded slowly. What do you want to know first? Where are they taking us? He had already read that from the navigation summary, visible on a guard's pad during the inspection. Kethara Prime. The Central World. The Grand Auction Yard, which was apparently a structure large enough to process 200,000 newly acquired individuals at any given time. From there, distribution to work sites across the Empire's 12 primary systems. 200,000 at any given time. I let that settle. The Ketharan had been doing this for 3,000 years. The scale of it was very large. The size of a thing can be paralyzing if you look at it all at once. So I did not look at it all at once. I looked at the piece in front of me. One ship, one hold, 112 people. That was enough to start with. On the third day, I began speaking to others. Not all of them. I selected carefully. There was a woman named Gwen Hartley, who had been the mission's chief engineer. Quiet, precise, the kind of person who could rebuild a reactor coupling from memory and low gravity. There was a man named Owen Clark who was 24 and had been a junior navigation officer, young, but with the specific kind of steadiness that some young people have, the kind that does not come from experience but from something deeper, from the way they were made. And there was a woman named Dina Fox, who had been ship security, and who was sitting with her back perfectly straight despite everything, because people like Dina Fox sat straight in burning buildings. I told them, quietly and quickly, what I knew. The wrist cuff. The camera angles, the guard rotation, the ventilation system, the fact that our captors believed we were too frightened to be worth worrying about. Dina looked at me for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "They made a mistake." "A large one," I agreed. "So what do we do?" "Right now," I said, "we watch, we learn, we remember. We do not do anything that tells them they were wrong about us. Not yet." "Not yet," she repeated, and something in her voice had shifted from the hollow sound of a person in shock to something else entirely, something patient and focused. "All right, what specifically are we watching for?" "Everything," I said. "The way the guards move. Which one is faster? Which one is older? What they do when they are not looking at us. What they eat, if we see it. What sounds mean what. Every single detail of this ship that we can gather without being obvious about it." Gwen had been quiet through all of this. Now she spoke. "The ventilation grate in the back corner. The vibration pattern changes when we drop below a certain thrust level. If the grate is standard Catharan fabrication, which it looks like, the locking mechanism is a simple pressure catch, designed for maintenance access. Not security, maintenance." I looked at her. "How long have you known that?" "Since about 6 hours after we were put in here," she said. I almost laughed. It was the best thing I had felt in days. The ship landed at Kethara Prime, on what I calculated was the 5th day. I say calculated because the light cycle in the hold never fully matched a 24-hour pattern, so I was tracking by guard rotations and meal intervals, which had their own rhythm. We felt the deceleration. We felt the landing gear engage. And then the door opened, and the blue light of the hold was replaced by a pale white glare from outside, and the Ketharan guards moved through, and the chains were unlinked from the floor rings. They left the wrist cuffs on. I walked out into Kethara Prime for the first time, and what I saw was a sky the color of old brass, a sun that was slightly too orange, and ahead of us a structure that stretched further in every direction than I could properly measure with my eyes. The Grand Auction Yard. It was the size of a city, but it had been built like a machine, with no wasted space, no decoration, nothing soft or human, nothing that suggested it had been built to house living things rather than inventory. I memorized the approach, the gate positions, the spacing of the guard towers, the direction of the primary sun at this time of day, which would tell me east from west, the sound of the city beyond the walls, muffled but present, meaning there was a populated area directly adjacent to the compound. The guard at the front drove us forward with the kind of casual authority that comes from never having been challenged. He was not watching for trouble. He was doing a routine job. In front of me, Callum walked with his head slightly tilted, reading signs, filing information. Behind me, I could feel Dina moving with her back straight, counting guard positions. Gwen was looking at walls the way engineers always look at walls. Owen was watching the sky, and I did not know why until later, when he told me he had been tracking flight paths of the small patrol drones overhead, counting how many there were, marking their patrol loops, timing their cycles. He had started doing that on his own, without being asked. That was when I understood something important. I had not created this. I had not built a team from nothing. What I had done was notice what was already there. Humans, when they are frightened and angry and stripped of everything familiar, do not simply collapse. Some do, yes. But many others do something different. They get very, very focused. They start looking for the edges of the problem, the boundaries of the cage, the place where the wall is thinnest. The Ketharan had categorized us as a fearful species, and in a sense they were right. We were afraid. Every one of us was carrying a weight of fear that would have crushed a person who had never learned to keep going under a heavy load. But they had made a very fundamental error in their assessment. They had seen the fear, and concluded that was all there was. They had never considered that fear and planning were not opposites, that a human being could be terrified and still be measuring the distance to the exit. They put us in a processing facility that smelled of disinfectant and something sharper, and they began what Callum later told me was called the submission assessment. It was their standard procedure for every new species, a battery of tests designed to determine how quickly and completely a species could be broken down and reshaped into a compliant labor source. They had never gotten an anomalous result. They were about to. I sat in the assessment room and I looked at the Ketharan scientist across the table from me, a gray-green face with those wide-set eyes, both of them looking at different things at once, and I thought about the chain around my wrist, and the grate in the ventilation system, and the orbital paths of the patrol drones, and the exact angle of the Ketharan sun through the window in the far wall. I thought about all of it at once, the way I always did, with the calm of someone who has been alone in deep space and learned that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. The scientist made a clicking note on his pad. Then he looked at me, one eye and then the other, and said, through my translation chip, "Do you understand why you are here?" "Yes," I said. He had expected hesitation. He had expected submission or hostility, something he had seen before. He had not expected the flat, quiet certainty of that single word. He looked at me for a long time. I looked back. I was already counting the seconds between his note-taking pauses, because the rhythm of a person's habits tells you about the rhythm of their thinking, and understanding how your opponent thinks is the first step in knowing what they will not see coming. He wrote something on his pad. Later, when Callum caught a glimpse of it, he translated it for me. It said, "Unusual. Monitor." I would have liked to tell that scientist how right he was, but there would be time for that. There was, I was increasingly certain, going to be quite a lot of time. The assessment room had no windows, but it had a ventilation grate in the upper left corner, and the grate had a pressure catch lock, identical to the one Gwen had identified on the ship. I had been in the room for 4 hours across 2 separate sessions, and in that time I had already determined that the room shared a wall with what sounded like a fluid processing system, based on the low gurgling that traveled through the metal at irregular intervals. The floor was a composite material, not solid plate, which meant it had cavities underneath, which meant there were service passages. Every large facility built for industrial processing had service passages. My name is Ilara Voss. I was 31 years old. I was in a room designed to measure how quickly I would break. The scientist across from me was named Sithari. I only learned that later, but from the first session I understood certain things about her without needing her name. She was not cruel. That was the first distinction I drew. The Ketharan guards were often careless with their authority in the way that people are when they have held power for a very long time without it ever being questioned. Sithari was different. She watched us the way a person watches something they are genuinely trying to understand. She took notes constantly. She asked precise questions, and when the answers did not match her expectations, she asked them again from a different angle. She was a scientist, and scientists, in my experience, are dangerous in a very specific way. They are dangerous because they follow the evidence, even when the evidence takes them somewhere they did not expect to go. She would follow the evidence, eventually. The question was how long we had before she understood what she was looking at. The submission assessment had 3 phases. Callum had heard enough guard conversations in the processing corridors to piece together the structure. The first phase was isolation and environmental stress, which mostly meant keeping people in small rooms with uncomfortable temperatures and irregular lighting, and meals that came at unpredictable times. The theory was that disrupting a species' biological rhythms would produce a state of confusion and dependence that made them easier to manage. The second phase was what the Ketharan called behavioral calibration, which meant introducing controlled discomfort to measure pain tolerance and compliance thresholds. The records they kept on each species allowed them to calculate exactly how much pressure was needed to produce cooperation, and they had found that most species reached a tipping point relatively quickly. The third phase was placement. Once a species had been assessed and categorized, individuals were distributed to work sites according to the labor profile that matched their biological characteristics. They ran us through phase 1 first. They put us in small holding cells, 12 people each, and they varied the temperature between cold and uncomfortably warm, and the lights went off without warning and came back on at odd hours, and meals appeared at times that had no relationship to any pattern I could find in the first 2 days. I tried hard to find a pattern. There was none. They had deliberately randomized it. So we made our own. Gwen was in my cell. So was Owen. The other 9 people were mostly survey crew, a mix of scientists and support staff. And in the first hours, several of them were struggling with the cold and the darkness and the disorientation. I understood it. I had also felt it. That first deep pull of helplessness, when you realize the environment is not under your control, and you cannot predict what comes next. But I had spent months in environments I could not control. I knew something the Ketharan did not know about humans. something that perhaps no other species in their collection had shown them. We do not only adapt to environments, we reshape them. We are going to create our own schedule, I told the cell on the second day, when the lights were on and everyone was awake and the temperature was tolerable. Meals, sleep, exercise, everything. We are going to run on our own clock regardless of what they do with the lights or the food timing. A woman named Petra Lang, who had been a geological survey analyst, looked at me from across the cell. She was small and precise, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. They will disrupt it, she said. That is the whole point. They will try, I said. But they are working against a species that has been dealing with disrupted sleep and unpredictable environments for our entire evolutionary history. We did shift work on ships. We crossed time zones on Earth for thousands of years. We pulled all-night sessions and early morning starts and month-long polar expeditions with perpetual daylight. This, I gestured at the cell, is uncomfortable. It is not new. Petra considered that. Then she said, "What is the schedule?" We built one. Owen, who had a genuinely remarkable internal clock, became our timekeeper. Every 6 hours, we slept, regardless of what the lights were doing. Every 6 hours, we were awake, and we used that time. We talked. We taught each other things. Gwen explained the principles of structural engineering to people who had never studied it, and they listened with total focus, because focus was the only tool they had. Petra walked us through deep geology, explaining how to read rock strata for useful minerals, which in a mining facility was survival information. Owen talked about navigation, both spatial and by landmark, which was useful for memorizing the layout of any facility we might pass through. I taught what I knew: patience, observation, how to read a person's habits from the way they hold their body, how to store information without writing it down. When the lights went off in the middle of a session, we kept talking in the dark. When the temperature dropped, we sat together for warmth and kept talking. When the food arrived at 3 in the morning, we ate it and went back to sleep according to our schedule, not theirs. On the 4th day, a different guard arrived for the routine check, not the one we had been seeing. He stood in the doorway and looked at us, 12 humans sitting in a circle in the middle of the cell, one of them describing tectonic plate movement with gestures in the air. He stood there for a while, then he left. Sithari came to see me that afternoon. She sat across the small table in the assessment room, her pad in her upper hands, and she was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "Your group has maintained a consistent sleep cycle despite environmental disruption," she said, through the translation chip. "This is the 4th day." "Yes," I said. "No other species in our assessment history has done this, beyond the 2nd day." I did not say anything. She made a note. "Are you aware that you are participating in an assessment process?" "Yes." Another note. "Does this awareness affect your behavior?" "It affects everyone's behavior to know they are being watched," I said. "The question is, what it changes them into. Some people perform fear, some people perform compliance. I prefer to just be what I am." She looked at me with one eye, then the other, a long, careful look. "And what are you?" I thought about that, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to give her the honest one. "Someone who is paying attention," I said. She wrote something long on her pad. I watched the movement of her stylus. I was building a vocabulary of her writing patterns, because Ketharan script was something Callum had described to me, and I was working on recognizing letters from their shape. I was not fluent. I did not need to be fluent. I needed to recognize key words. I recognized one, the word she wrote most often when she looked up from me to the pad. Callum translated it later. The word was anomalous. Phase 2 came on day 7. The Ketharan were thorough record keepers, which meant they had precise protocols, and the protocol said that after 6 days of environmental conditioning, the behavioral calibration phase began. They brought a device into the assessment room, a metal arm mounted on a trolley, and the device at the end of the arm had a contact point that delivered a calibrated nerve stimulus, not harmful, designed to produce discomfort in order to measure the threshold at which compliance behaviors emerged. Sithari was not in the room for this phase. 2 assessment technicians ran it. One operated the device. One recorded. I had been told what to expect by Callum, who had overheard the technicians preparing and had listened carefully to everything they said. So when the contact came, I knew what it was, and I had prepared. Not to be numb to it, because I was not made of stone. It was unpleasant, but I had sat with discomfort before, in long survey missions and hard training, and 2 winters spent in minimal heat conditions on a research posting. Discomfort is a signal, not a sentence. It tells you that something is wrong. It does not tell you that nothing can be done. I sat with it. I breathed. I kept my face still. The technician operating the device increased the level. I kept breathing. He increased it again. I looked at the wall behind him, at a small seam in the plating where 2 panels met, and I thought about the service corridor that the seam suggested might be on the other side. He looked at his colleague. His colleague looked at the recording instrument. They exchanged a clicking conversation that my translation chip did not fully catch, but the tone was unmistakable. They had expected a different response. They left to consult with someone. I sat in the room alone, and I carefully noted every detail of the restraint point on the chair, the angle of the camera above the door, the sound of the ventilation system in this room versus the holding cell, and the fact that the door had a manual release lever on the inside that the second technician had touched on his way out. When they came back, they brought a third person. He adjusted the device settings and tried again, this time at a higher initial level. I thought about the service corridor. I thought about Owen's patrol drone count. I thought about the grate. At the end of the session, they filed out without speaking to me. Through the door, I heard one of them say something. Just a fragment, just enough for my chip to catch. The chip gave me, calibration data is invalid. No recognized response pattern. Phase 2 ended 2 days early. Sithari came back. She sat down across from me and put her pad on the table, and did not open it. She just looked at me. I want to ask you something directly, she said. Go ahead. Are you choosing not to respond, or are you genuinely not experiencing what the device is measuring? I am experiencing it, I said. Then why no response? I looked at her. What response did you expect? Submission behaviors, flinching, vocal distress, reduction in eye contact, posture changes. These are the standard indicators across every species we have assessed. They are biological responses to negative stimuli. They are not a choice. For most species, I said. She was very still. We feel it, I told her. All of us do. But humans have a long history of making choices that go against what our bodies are telling us to do. We have run into fires to pull out strangers. We have held still under surgical instruments, without numbing. We have sat in silence through things that hurt, not because we were not hurting, but because we decided that the choice was worth the cost. I paused. We are a species that decided, a very long time ago, that what we feel does not always determine what we do. Sithari looked at me for a very long time. Then she picked up her pad and wrote for several minutes without stopping. I watched the stylus. I caught 3 words I recognized from Callum's descriptions. Anomalous, organized, dangerous. She put down the pad. You will be distributed to work sites in 3 days, she said. Her voice had changed slightly. Not softer, more careful, like someone who has realized they are holding something heavier than they thought. I understand, I said. She stood to leave. At the door, she paused without turning around. What you said about going toward fire, she said, to pull out strangers. Yes, that is not rational. No, I agreed, but we do it anyway. She left. I looked at the table where her pad had been. I looked at the door. I looked at the seam in the wall panel. 3 days. In the processing corridors, I found Dina. Our cells were on the same block, and the movement between assessment rooms gave us brief windows when we could speak without being overheard. Dina had been through her own sessions. She told me about them without flinching, cataloging them the way she cataloged everything. Her cell had 11 other people, including 3 who had been in very bad shape in the early days. She had built a similar schedule to ours, but she had also done something else. She had made contact with the cell next door. How? I asked, keeping my voice at a murmur. The wall between the cells has a ventilation cavity, she said, about 3 inches thick. Sound carries, if you speak directly into the lower vent on the right side. There are humans in the next cell, and humans in the cell beyond that. I have spoken to both. I looked at her. How many cells can we reach? In my block, 6. Possibly 8 if we find the right acoustic points. 6 cells, 12 people each, 72 people, plus my 12, plus any others on the other side of my block. We were spread across the facility, but we were not isolated. We were never as isolated as they thought. Start passing information, I said. Not plans, not yet. Information only. Names, cell numbers if they can determine them. Anything useful about the facility that people have observed. Build the picture. Dina nodded. Once, sharp, the nod of someone who had already been thinking the same thing. A guard moved us along. Dina went one way, I went the other. But the line between us did not break. 3 days became 2, then 1. And on the morning of the distribution day, when the guards came to move us to the transit staging area, I walked through the corridors of the grand auction yard with my head slightly tilted, reading every surface, every sign, every door and junction and guard position, storing all of it in the same internal archive where I kept everything else. The Ketharan had run their assessment. They had their results. In their records, 112 humans were classified as Tier 3 labor, difficult batch, distribution authorized. What their records did not contain, could not contain, was the actual result of their assessment. The result Sithari had come closest to seeing. The one word she had written at the end of her final session report, that her superiors had flagged as excessive caution from an over-analytical researcher. Dangerous. She had been right. She had been more right than she knew. We were loaded onto a distribution transport. I sat beside Callum, who sat beside Gwen, who sat across from Owen and Dina and Petra. We did not speak on the transport. We did not need to. We had been speaking for days, through walls and whispers and timed pauses in the ventilation corridors. We had been building something that the Ketharan did not have a category for because in 3,000 years of operating this system, no species had given them reason to create the category. The moon of Veldrath appeared in the viewport as the transport descended. A dark world, carved and scarred from decades of extraction, lit from beneath by the glow of deep mine shafts. Owen leaned slightly toward me. 43 drones in the high orbit pattern, he said quietly. Patrol cycle is 11 minutes per loop. There is a dead zone in the northwest quarter of the landing field that none of them cover for approximately 90 seconds per cycle. I looked out the viewport. I looked at the dark, carved world below. Good, I said. And the transport landed, and the door opened, and we walked out into Veldrath, and none of the guards watching us had any idea whatsoever that the most carefully organized thing in 4-star systems had just been dropped off at their front door, wearing chains it could already get out of. The mine was deeper than I expected. That was the first thing I learned about Veldrath, standing on the surface and looking down into the main extraction shaft, which dropped into a darkness that the work lights below did not fully reach. The second thing I learned was the smell of the ore dust, a dry mineral scent that coated the back of the throat within the first hour. The third thing I learned was the sound the extraction equipment made, a low, rhythmic grinding that did not stop. Not during the work shifts, not during the break periods, not during the night cycle. It was a sound designed for machinery, not for living creatures. It did not consider that anyone below might want silence. There were 3 other species working Veldrath. The Thurin were insectoid, about 1.5 meters tall, with 6 limbs and a chitinous outer shell that ranged from pale brown to near black. They moved efficiently and worked in close coordination, passing tools and signaling each other with brief vibrations of their outer shell plates. But they moved with the specific efficiency of beings who have stopped expecting anything to change. It was the efficiency of long defeat. The Malvine were amphibian, broader than humans and low to the ground, with wide, flat hands that were well suited for the ore sorting work. Their skin was a dull greenish gray, and their breathing was labored in the mine environment, which was drier than their biology preferred. 3 of the 7 Malvine assigned to our work level had a persistent cough that the Ketharan supervisors had filed as a non-critical health note, meaning they considered it acceptable attrition. The Oshari were avian. They should not have been underground at all. They were tall, with folded wing structures along their forearms, and their eyes had been built for open sky and long distances, not for close work in dim shafts. They moved carefully in the tunnels, with the particular carefulness of creatures forced into a space they were never meant to inhabit. They did not speak, at least not in any way I could hear. They communicated with each other through subtle shifts in feather position, and small head movements. Most of the Ketharan supervisors had concluded they were largely non-communicative. They were wrong. Our shift supervisor was a Ketharan named Vrethik. I recognized him. He had been on the transport ship, the one with the silver rod, the one who had lifted Callum's face to the light and said soft and fragile with such satisfaction. He walked through the work levels with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never had a problem he could not solve, with authority and a data pad. He assigned us to ore sorting on the 3rd level, which was approximately 40 meters down. The work was straightforward, in the way that all brutal things are straightforward when described simply. Load ore into the sorting bins, separate by grade, move the bins to the conveyance track, repeat. The equipment was heavy. The air was dry and mineral thick. The lighting was functional at best. Gwen had the 3rd level mapped in her head within 2 hours. She told me about it in fragments, during the 30-minute break period when the equipment went quiet, and the supervisors retreated to their station at the top of the shaft. The level had 4 active work sections and 2 sealed sections that showed signs of recent excavation damage, meaning collapses or instability. The support structure used a standard Ketharan beam system, with a specific repeating pattern that she recognized from the hull construction on their transport ships. The conveyance track connected to a main shaft that ran from the surface all the way to the deepest working level, currently level 9. The power system for the work lights and the equipment was routed through 2 main junction boxes, both on the main shaft wall, both accessible from the conveyance track with minimal obstruction. "What is the collapse risk on those 2 sealed sections?" I asked. High. Without remediation," she said. "The support beams on the left one are slightly off angle. Probably happened during whatever caused the original damage. It would not take much to make it worse. Or," she added, "to make it significantly better." "Better," I said. "Always better, for now." She understood what I meant. We were not going to make anything worse. We were going to make things better, safer, more efficient. Because a mine where fewer accidents happened was a mine where the Ketharan supervisors had less to worry about, and supervisors who had less to worry about paid less attention to the details that did not require their attention. We were going to become invisible through competence. Callum worked the same level. He was sorting ore like everyone else, but Callum was also listening. He spent that first week building a vocabulary from the supervisor's conversations, filling in gaps in his existing knowledge of the language, developing a near-complete working understanding of the daily operational communications around us. By the end of the week, he could follow most of what the Ketharan said to each other when they thought no one was listening. What they said, mostly, was logistics, supply arrival times, equipment maintenance schedules, personnel rotation dates, the names of the administrators who would be visiting from the upper levels, the expected extraction targets for the coming months. None of it was secret in the sense of being hidden. It was simply spoken in a language they assumed we could not understand. About operations they assumed we had no interest in. We had enormous interest in all of it. Owen made contact with human workers on the other levels within the first 3 days. The mine had a communication problem that the Ketharan had never needed to solve, because the species they usually worked with communicated through sounds or signals that did not carry well through rock. But humans communicated through patterns, and patterns could travel through many mediums. Owen found that the conveyance track vibrated when the equipment was off, and that specific sequences of taps on the track wall created a signal distinguishable from the general background noise of the settling rock. He taught it to the others on our level. They taught it to humans on the level above. Within 2 weeks, we had a tapping code running through the entire mine, from level 1 to level 9, and we were passing information up and down the shaft in a steady, quiet stream that the Ketharan supervisors walked past a dozen times a day without ever recognizing it for what it was. The information told us many things. The mine had, across all 9 levels, 203 humans, plus the other species. There were Thurin on every level, and Malvine on the upper 4, and Oshari on levels 1 through 3. Total working population of the mine was close to 600 individuals. I asked Callum, on the 9th day, whether there was any record of different slave species communicating with each other in Ketharan history. He said that in 3,000 years of records, there was no documented case of successful interspecies coordination among slave populations. The Ketharan had, early in their history, identified interspecies bonding as a risk factor and had designed their work assignments to prevent it by keeping species separated, except during shared work shifts, where the noise and distraction of the work environment and the different communication methods of each species made coordination impractical. They had never accounted for a species that was good at finding ways around impractical. I spent 3 days watching the Thurin. I watched how they worked, how they signaled each other, how they responded to the supervisors, how they behaved during breaks. Slowly, through observation and a few careful experiments, I found that the shell plate vibrations they used to communicate had a visible component. A trained eye could read broad categories of meaning from the pattern of vibrations, even without hearing the specific frequency. I began to learn it, not fluently, enough. And on the 12th day, during a break period on the 3rd level, I sat down near the Thurin elder who worked our section. She was old, with a shell that had faded to near white at the edges, and she worked with the slow, meticulous patience of someone who had been doing this for a very long time. I touched the floor between us with my fingertip and tapped a pattern I had prepared. Simple, basic, the closest equivalent I could construct to, "I see you. I am paying attention. I do not wish to harm you." She looked at me. Her shell plates shifted in a fine, subtle movement. My translation was imperfect, but I believed it meant, "I hear you." Her name, I eventually learned, was Suri. In the weeks that followed, Suri taught me more. Not language exactly, but enough to establish communication, and through that communication, she told me things about Veldrath that no supervisor's report would ever contain. She knew which tunnels were safe and which were not, from decades of accumulated experience that the Ketharin had never bothered to record because they had never needed Thurin expertise for anything other than labor. She knew the water table position beneath the mine, which mattered for structural stability. She knew which ore grades produced toxic dust at higher concentrations and which were safe. She knew the supply cycles of every resource the mine depended on. She told me this information over several days, and as I received it, I passed it through the tapping network to the other levels, and the humans absorbed it and incorporated it into their own growing picture of the facility. I also did something that surprised Suri. I could tell from the shell movement when I explained it. I started sharing our information with her. Not all of it. Not the operational security information, the things that could cause problems if they reached the wrong ears, but the practical information, the safety information, the things that would help the Thurin work more safely and stay alive longer. Suri was quiet for a while after I explained this. Then her shell plates moved in something I had started to associate with a question. I had Callum with me. He had been developing his own way of communicating with the Malvine in sign-adjacent gestures, and he was getting better at reading the Thurin shell language than I was. He watched her movements and said quietly, "She wants to know why you would share something useful with another species. She says it does not happen." "Tell her," I said, "that where I come from, we have a very old idea, that people who are in the same difficult situation become something to each other. Not just people who are together, something more specific." Callum relayed this as best he could. Suri was still for a moment, then her plates shifted in a long, complex movement. Callum was quiet for a second, then he said, "I think she just said the word for family." I looked at Suri, this ancient insect person with her faded white-edged shell, who had been in this mine longer than I had been alive, who had lost count of how many of her own kind had not come home from the deep shafts. "Yes," I said. "Something like that." The productivity numbers began to change in the 3rd week. The Ketharan supervisors tracked output carefully, and their records showed that the human work groups were producing at a rate about 12% above the expected Tier 3 average. They wrote this up as a calibration note. New species sometimes showed higher initial output before settling into the standard range. What their records did not show was why the numbers were higher. The numbers were higher because Gwen had identified the exact angle at which the ore sorting bins should be positioned to reduce the time per load by about 8 seconds, and because Dina had worked out a rotation system that kept the 3 fastest sorters on the bins at peak efficiency times, and because Owen had noticed that the conveyance track jammed less often if you loaded it from the left side rather than the right. Small things. The kind of things that accumulate. The Ketharan supervisors saw the numbers and were mildly pleased. They did not see the other thing that was changing. The Malvine workers on the upper levels had stopped coughing as frequently. because Callum had recognized that the particular dry particulate that irritated their respiratory system was concentrated near the eastern sorting stations, and the humans on those levels had quietly shifted the Malvine away from those stations, without making it obvious enough to attract supervisor attention. The Oshari on level 2 had stopped the careful, pained movements they had been making for weeks, because a human named Ned Gorman, who had been a field medic before the survey mission, had worked out that the particular way they were holding their folded wing structures while working was creating muscle strain, and he had made a small suggestion through gesture and demonstration that had helped. The other species were not performing dramatically better, nothing that would trigger a supervisor review, but they were surviving more easily, and they were noticing who was responsible for that. Suri told me something at the end of the 3rd week that Callum translated carefully, because he wanted to get it exactly right. She said, "In 3,000 years of Ketharan slavery, no species has ever tried to help another species survive their captivity. The Ketharan designed it this way deliberately. Separate species, different languages, no common ground. They knew that the most dangerous thing was not one species resisting. The most dangerous thing was species who forgot that the Ketharan wanted them to see each other as strangers." She paused. Her plates moved. "You did not forget." "No," I said. "We did not forget." On the 28th day of our time on Veldrath, Vrethik came down to the 3rd level. This was unusual. He usually stayed at the surface station. He walked through the work area with his datapad, reviewing something with a frown that my translation chip caught as an expression of administrative concern. He stopped near the junction of the 2 main work sections and looked around. His eyes moved across us, the humans sorting, the Thurin on the far bins, the equipment moving steadily on the track. He looked at the output figures on a wall display. He looked back at us. Then he made a notation on his pad and left. Callum told me later, having read the wall display Vrethik had been looking at, that the figure shown was the monthly cumulative output for level 3. It was running at 19% above the facility standard. Vrethik's notation, according to what Callum could catch in the brief moment it was visible on his pad, said, "Review cause of elevated output. Check equipment calibration." He thought the equipment had been miscalibrated. He did not consider the alternative. That night, in the dormitory block where the humans were housed in long shared rooms, I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the tapping network, and Suri's 3,000 years, and the 19%, and the wrist cuff that was still not tight enough, though I had not used that information yet, because the time was not right. The time was not right for many things, but it was getting closer. Dina came and sat on the edge of my bunk. She did so quietly, the way Dina did everything. "I talked to the group from level 7 today," she said. "Through the network. And? They have a woman named Cora Finch on their level. She was a signals engineer on the original survey mission. She says she has been looking at the equipment on her level, and she thinks she can build something with the components available." I was quiet for a moment. Define something. "A transmitter," Dina said. "Small, low power. She thinks she can adapt parts from the ore sorting equipment during maintenance windows. She says it would take 6 to 8 months to build correctly." 6 to 8 months. In 6 to 8 months, we would have been on Veldrath for most of a year. We would know every tunnel, every schedule, every guard cycle, every weakness in the facility's operational design. We would have a communication network running through the whole mine. We would have relationships with 203 other humans, and growing relationships with 3 other species, who were beginning to understand that we were not what the Ketharon said we were. And we would have a transmitter. "Tell Cora to start," I said. Dina nodded. "Then, there are other sites, other humans, not just us. I know. If we had a transmitter, we could reach them. That is the idea." She was quiet for a moment. Vrethik looked nervous today, when he was on the level. "Did you notice?" "I noticed." "He has been doing this job for a long time," she said, and something in those numbers made him nervous. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about Sithari, writing anomalous on her pad. I thought about the assessment technicians calling for a 3rd person when their calibration data came back invalid. I thought about Vrethik standing in the work area looking at output figures with a frown that was just slightly too tight. "Good," I said. "They should be nervous. They should have been nervous from the beginning, but the beginning was gone. And what mattered now was the present. The present was a tapping code through 9 levels of rock, and a signals engineer named Cora Finch who was going to spend 6 months building something, while a mine supervisor looked at his numbers and tried to figure out why his equipment was suddenly outperforming its specifications. The present was 112 humans in a facility built to hold livestock, building something it had never been designed to contain. The present was Suri's shell plates moving in the pattern that meant family. And underneath all of it, quiet and steady, as the grinding of the extraction equipment that never stopped, the present was the knowledge that the Ketharan had made us into something. They had not intended to. They had intended to make us into labor. But by putting us in this mine and surrounding us with people from 3 other species who needed help, and by designing a system so complete in its confidence that they had never needed to secure the details, they had given us time and proximity and motivation and just enough operational access to be genuinely dangerous. They had been trying to domesticate us. They had instead given us a classroom, and we were very, very good students. Month 4 arrived without the Ketharan understanding that something had fundamentally changed. That was the thing about what we were building. It did not look like anything they had learned to recognize as a threat. It looked like a mine that was running quietly and efficiently. It looked like a population of workers who stayed in their dormitory blocks at night and caused no disturbances, and met their output requirements without complaint. They were proud of that. Vrethik wrote a report, Callum told me after catching the screen in the supervisor station one afternoon. The report said the human acquisition, while initially flagged as a difficult batch, had integrated into facility operations without incident. He had included the output figures. He had received a commendation from the regional administrator. He had framed it on his office wall. I thought about that a lot. About a person hanging a picture on a wall to celebrate something they had entirely misunderstood. My name is Alara Voss. In month 4 of our time on Veldrath, I was running the most complex coordinated intelligence operation in the facility's history, and the man responsible for the facility had just received an award for my work. The tapping network had evolved. Owen and a human on level 6 named Ada Price, who had been a linguistics researcher, had spent 2 months refining and expanding the original code until it could carry nuanced information, rather than just basic signals. Ada had an extraordinary mind for structured language, and she had built the code into something capable of transmitting full sentences efficiently, using rhythm patterns that sounded to any outside ear like nothing more than the natural settling sounds of the rock around us. Through the network, we had built a map of Veldrath more complete than any document in the facility's operational records. We knew the deep levels, the stable tunnels, and the dangerous ones. We knew the surface layout, the landing pad, the guard quarters, the equipment storage. We knew the water processing system and the food supply chain, and the medical facility, which was minimal and under-resourced, and the communications array that connected Veldrath to the broader Ketharan administrative network. That communications array was on the surface, in a square building behind the main supervisor station. It was operated by 2 Ketharan technicians who worked alternating shifts. The building had 1 door. It was locked with a biometric system keyed to Ketharan physiology. Cora Finch, on level 7, had been building her transmitter for 3 months. She sent progress reports through the network every 8 days. She was methodical and careful and infuriatingly precise about not rushing ahead of what the available components could safely support. The transmitter was growing. On the surface, things were also growing, in a different direction. I had been making careful, slow progress with Suri's people, and through Suri, with the Malvine and, gradually, through the Ashari worker on level 1 whose name required a sound human vocal cords could not quite make, but who accepted Callum's phonetic approximation of os, without visible objection. The interspecies communication was still limited, still fragile, built from gesture and careful repetition, and the kind of patience that required you to accept being misunderstood many times before being understood once. But it was real. And what had grown from it was something Suri had told me did not exist in Ketharan records, because it had never existed before. The species of Veldrath were looking out for each other. Not dramatically, not in any way that would trigger a supervisor's alert. Small things. A Thuran worker on level 4 who had been showing signs of overextension was quietly moved to less demanding stations by his human co-workers, who had noticed before the supervisors had. A group of Malvine on level 2 who had been assigned to a section where the air circulation was worse had found that their morning shift began with a brief ventilation adjustment that the humans in the dormitory adjacent to the system had been making before the work cycle started. An Oshari on level 1 who had stopped eating properly, as much as Ned Gorman could determine from observation, had started receiving food from the human ration distribution, in the form of items that his biology could actually process, after Callum spent a week talking to him through gesture and determining which human ration components were compatible. None of this was visible in any supervisor report. None of it registered on any monitoring system. It existed only in the space between us, in the understanding that had grown where the Ketharan had tried to plant separation. Suri came to sit with me during a break period on the 41st day of the 4th month. She brought another Thuran elder, one I had not spoken to before, whose shell was darker, and whose movements were slower. She introduced him with a pattern I could read clearly. He was the oldest surviving worker on Veldrath. He had been in this mine for more than 30 years. I sat across from him and I looked at him and I thought about 30 years underground in the dark, and I felt something that I had been carefully managing for 4 months, something I did not allow to surface during work or planning or network sessions, because feeling it too strongly during those times would cloud the thinking. But sitting across from this ancient person who had been in this mine for 30 years, I let it surface for a moment. Not anger, not grief, something more focused, something that had been building since the ship, since the assessment rooms, since the first time I had sat in a cell and started counting cameras. Purpose. I did not have a word in any language I knew for exactly what it was. It was not revenge. It was not justice, though justice was part of it. It was something closer to a decision made so completely that it had stopped being a decision and become a simple fact about the world, the way it is a fact that water runs downhill and that the sun rises in the east. The Ketharan had built this system over 3,000 years. They had built it carefully and completely, and with enormous confidence in its permanence. They had never had reason to think otherwise. We were going to give them a reason. Cora Finch finished the transmitter on day 214 of our time on Veldrath. She sent the message through the network in Ada's refined code, and the information traveled from level 7 to level 3 in approximately 40 seconds. I sat with Gwen and Owen, and Dina, and Callum, and Ned and Petra, and we did not celebrate, because there was nothing to celebrate yet. The transmitter was a tool. Tools were only useful when the time to use them was right. We had been on Veldrath for over 7 months. In that time, we had learned more about this facility than most of the Ketharan who worked in it. We had built a network through 9 levels of rock. We had established communication and cooperation with 3 other species who had been in the mine for decades, without anyone ever trying to include them in anything. We had maintained our schedule, our health, our productivity, and our invisibility. The time was not right yet. The time was going to require one more piece. I asked Callum to listen more carefully to the administrative communications from the surface. Not the operational day-to-day, but the higher-level traffic, the things that came in from regional administration and above. He had been doing this already, but I needed him to listen for something specific. I needed to know if humans on the other sites were in contact with anyone outside. I needed to know if any of the other 11 sites where humans had been distributed were doing anything similar to what we were doing here. I needed to know if we were alone, or if Veldrath was one node in something larger. It took 3 weeks to find out. The information did not come from Callum directly. It came from Ada, through the network, because Ada had been doing the same thing on level 6, with a Malvine worker, who had been on Veldrath for 18 years, and who had been, in that time, moved through 3 different sites, before ending up here. This Malvine worker, through careful months of communication with Ada, had told her something he had observed at a previous site. At that site, 12 years earlier, there had been humans, and the humans at that site had been doing something with ore shipments. Shipping ore between sites was standard procedure. Quality samples went from extraction sites to processing facilities. Normal traffic, unremarkable, except that the humans at that previous site had apparently been marking certain ore pieces in a specific, consistent way, a way that was invisible to any casual inspection, but that, if you knew what to look for, formed a pattern. The Malvine worker had noticed, because he had an eye for patterns, the way many of his species did, a particular visual acuity that the Ketharan supervisors had never studied closely enough to understand. He had not known what the pattern meant. He had assumed it was accidental or irrelevant. But I knew what it meant. It meant we had not invented this. It meant someone before us had had the same idea. It meant the humans who had come through this system before us, years ago, on a different site, had been trying to build the same thing we were building. A network between sites. They had not succeeded, as far as the Malvine worker knew. They had been moved before anything came of it. But they had tried. I sat with that for a long time, in the dark of the dormitory after the others were asleep. I sat with the knowledge that humans, put into this system, had independently arrived at the same basic response: observe, organize, connect. We had not been taught to do this. No one had planned it in advance. There had been no strategic document prepared before our capture that said, if taken as slaves, do the following. We had done it because it was what humans do, because when you take a species that spent its entire evolutionary history in small cooperative groups, working together to solve problems that none of them could solve alone, and you drop that species into a difficult environment and give them time and each other, this is what you get. We were not special. We were not extraordinary. We were simply very, very much ourselves. The ore shipments left Veldrath twice a month. The next shipment was in 11 days. I called a full network meeting, passing the message through all 9 levels, which took most of an afternoon to coordinate through Ada's system. That night, during the quiet hour before sleep, when the supervisors were in their station, and the guards were in their rotation, and the mine was as close to unwatched as it ever got, I spoke quietly to the network, and the network carried my voice through 9 levels of rock in taps and rhythms. I told them what I had learned about the other site, 12 years ago. I told them what it meant, and I told them what I thought we should do. There were questions. Good questions, careful ones, from people who had spent months developing exactly the kind of analytical thinking that this situation required. Ada had concerns about signal security in the marks. Owen had questions about the timing windows in the shipping schedule. Dina had a long list of operational considerations about what information to include and what to withhold. We worked through all of it, over 3 nights, in whispers and taps through rock. And on the day of the ore shipment, 11 days later, the ore that went into the standard shipping containers had markings on certain pieces, subtle enough to survive automated inspection, specific enough to be read by anyone who had been told what to look for. The markings contained a basic pattern, a code structure, an invitation. If any humans on any other site received those containers, if any of them were doing what we were doing, if any of them had the same instinct to look closer at things that seemed normal, they would find it. We did not know if they would. We did not know if any humans on other sites had survived in the same way we had, with the same networks, the same patience, the same refusal to stop looking for the edges of the problem. We sent the message anyway. Because that was the other thing about humans that the Ketharan had not fully modeled in their assessment. We were not only patient and observant and cooperative, we were also, at our core, irrationally hopeful. We sent signals into the dark, even when we did not know if anyone was listening. We built communication systems in silence, and expected them to eventually reach someone. We were the species that had pointed radio telescopes at empty sky for generations, sending transmissions outward, with no confirmation that anything was out there to receive them. We had done it anyway. And sometimes, the thing you transmit into the dark transmits something back. The response came on the 3rd ore shipment after ours, which was 6 weeks later. It came on 2 pieces of ore in the standard intake batch, marked in the same basic pattern we had used, but with a reply structure built on top of it. Someone had understood. Someone on another site had found the message and read it, and had the same system for encoding information, and had replied. Ada decoded it in one night, working by memory in the dark of her dormitory, and sent the full text through the network by morning. It said, "We hear you, with Site 41 humans. We have been waiting." They had been waiting. Site 4 had 41 humans, who had apparently been doing this alone for months before we found them. They had a network of their own. They had information about their facility. They had been trying, without success, to reach other sites. I sat with Dina in the break area that afternoon, the 2 of us eating our rations in the company of a Thurin worker who had, over the past months, learned to sit with humans during breaks without it appearing unusual to a passing supervisor. "Site 4, Dina said, Site 4, I agreed. How many sites are there total? 12, I said. We know this from the distribution documents Callum read during transport. So we have 1 in 4, she said. 10 more. 10 more, I said. She was quiet for a moment, eating methodically. The ore shipments go to a central processing hub, she said, not just between sites. They go to the hub, and from the hub to wherever they are needed, which means a message sent from the hub could theoretically reach any site. Yes, I said. If we could get a message to someone at the hub. We would need someone at the hub, I said, or something going through the hub that carries a signal. She was quiet again, calculating. The maintenance equipment, she said slowly. It rotates. Old equipment goes back for servicing. New equipment comes in. The service route goes through the hub. I looked at her. There is a Thurin worker on level 8, she said, who has been here for 22 years. She told Suri that she was at the hub facility for 3 months, 4 years ago, on a temporary reassignment. She remembers the layout. I thought about this carefully. I thought about Suri and the Malvine worker with his pattern-reading eyes, and the Ashari, who had accepted Ned's dietary adjustments, with the particular grace of someone who has learned to trust slowly and carefully. We should talk to her, I said. She already wants to talk to you, Dina said. Suri arranged it. That is why I am telling you now. I looked at Dina. She looked back at me with the flat, precise steadiness that I had come to understand was her version of a smile. The Thurin worker from level 8 was named, as closely as the shell language could be transliterated, something like Tech. She had been at the hub. She remembered its layout with the same careful precision that Thurin used for everything, and she had something else, something she had been keeping for 4 years without knowing who to give it to. She knew the name of a Ketharan technician at the hub who had, 4 years ago, shown her something that had stayed with her. The technician had shown her a communications console. Not intentionally. He had been negligent, leaving a screen visible while he stepped away, but Tech had looked at it, with her excellent insect eyes, and she had remembered what she saw. She remembered the frequency signature. She remembered the transmission structure. She remembered enough that Cora Finch, who Ada brought into the conversation through the network, listened carefully to the technical description, and was very quiet for a long time afterward. Then Cora sent back through the network, I can do more than I thought. Give me 2 more months. The ore shipments continued. 11 more sites. We sent to all of them, through the hub routing that the maintenance equipment cycle allowed. Piggyback signals too small for automated detection, built on the foundational code that Ada and Cora had developed together across 7 levels of rock. Over the next 2 months, 8 more sites responded. 8 sites. Hundreds of humans. Each of them had been waiting. Each of them had been building something in the dark. Each of them had been watching and memorizing and filing away information that they had no way of using alone. They were not alone anymore. On the 287th day of our time on Veldrath, Cora Finch sent a message through the network that was longer than any she had sent before. Ada decoded it and relayed it level by level until it reached me on level 3. It said, transmitter is ready, range is sufficient. I can reach human colony frequencies from Veldrath surface if I have 37 seconds of clear signal time from the communications array building. I need access to the building's external relay junction. The junction is accessible from the northeast corner of the surface compound. Guard rotation leaves that corner clear for 94 seconds once per patrol cycle. I have calculated the window. I need 11 minutes of facility-wide distraction during the patrol gap to get Cora to the surface, to the junction, and the signal out. I read that twice. 11 minutes. I thought about the sealed tunnel sections that Gwen had been monitoring for months. The left one with the off-angle support beams. She had told me, in casual technical terms, that the angle was now measurably worse than it had been in month 1. The structure was under progressive stress, a controlled, deliberate adjustment to the support configuration on level 5, done by someone who understood exactly what they were doing, could produce a loud and visually significant structural event in that sealed section. Non-catastrophic, no one in the area, but loud enough and significant enough to pull every supervisor and guard in the facility toward it for at least 15 minutes. Gwen had told me this 3 months ago. I had filed it away. I called a full network session that night, all 9 levels, all 203 humans on Veldrath, Plus, through Suri and Tech and the others, the Thurin and Malvine and Oshari, who had spent months learning to communicate with us and trust us in the specific, careful way that trust builds between people who have no reason to expect it. I told them the plan. The plan required timing, coordination, and complete silence until the moment it began. It required Gwen on level 5 and 2 engineers from level 6 who had been studying the support system alongside her for weeks. It required Owen tracking the surface patrol drone cycle with the same precision he had maintained since day one. It required Ned and his medical knowledge staged at specific points in case of any injury from the structural event. It required Dina managing the movement of 3 people to the surface during the distraction window, because Cora could not go alone, and neither could the person who would provide cover. It required every person in the network to know their role and maintain normal behavior in all other respects, until the moment everything changed. The night before, I sat with Suri in the dormitory break area, just the 2 of us, because the other Thurin knew enough to give this space. She had her old shell folded around herself and she was very still. I said, through the vocabulary we had built together over months, what we do tomorrow does not only help us. She moved her plate slowly. I said, if this reaches our people outside, they will come, and when they come, they will not leave you here. She was still for a long time. Her plates moved in the pattern that I now knew well, the pattern that meant certainty, the pattern that meant something like yes, but not just yes, more than yes, something that included gratitude and grief and a long, long wait that was finally reaching its end. I put my hand on the floor between us, the way I had the very first time, on day 12, when I had tapped my simple message of, I see you. She put one of her 6 hands next to mine. The morning of day 288 arrived the same as every other morning on Veldrath. The light cycle changed. The extraction equipment started. The supervisors went to their stations. Vrethik arrived in his usual mid-morning window to review the overnight figures. He looked at the output display. He looked satisfied. He had no idea what day this was. At precisely the 43rd minute of the mid-morning shift, when the surface patrol drone was at the beginning of its northwest sector loop, and Owen had confirmed through his count that the window was opening, Gwen and her 2 colleagues on level 5 made the adjustment to the support configuration in the sealed left section. The sound it made was enormous. I heard it from level 3. The whole mine heard it. The supervisors heard it, and every guard heard it, and Vrethik heard it at his display in the surface station. And within 60 seconds, the emergency response system had redirected every available personnel resource toward the sealed section on level 5 for structural assessment. 11 minutes. We had 11 minutes. I know how long 11 minutes is. I have counted seconds in the dark too many times to be casual about it. 11 minutes is 660 seconds. It is a very specific length of time, and every one of those seconds was occupied. In 660 seconds, Dina moved Cora Finch from level 7 to the surface access point. In 660 seconds, Owen counted drone positions and talked Dina through the exact path with the minimum exposure. In 660 seconds, Cora reached the northeast corner of the surface compound and found the external relay junction exactly where Tech's 4-year-old memory had placed it. And in 37 of those 660 seconds, Cora Finch opened the relay junction and connected the transmitter she had built from ore sorting components over 6 months of careful, patient, methodical work, and she sent a signal. The signal went up through Veldrath's communications relay, piggybacked on the facility's own equipment, using the frequency structure that Tech had memorized 4 years ago from a technician who had not been careful enough with his screen. The signal left Ketharan space in the direction of the nearest human colony frequency. It contained everything: maps of all 12 sites, guard schedules, administrative structures, facility layouts built from months of accumulated observation, the full scope of the Ketharan slave trade, documented in operational detail that no outside source had ever possessed, the locations of every facility in the Empire that we had learned from administrative communications, the names and positions of regional administrators, the supply chains and logistics networks and the communications infrastructure that held all of it together. We had spent 8 months watching and listening and storing every piece of information they had not thought to hide from us, because they had never imagined it mattered. It mattered. Cora disconnected and Dina moved her back to the access point in under 2 minutes, and they were both on level 7 before the supervisors had completed their initial assessment of the structural event on level 5, which Gwen had ensured was loud and significant, but completely harmless, because Gwen knew the difference between a sound that caused structural collapse and a sound that merely sounded like one. Vrethik came down at the end of the shift to review the incident. He found a minor support adjustment failure in a sealed section. No personnel involved, no production impact, minimal structural concern. He wrote it up as a maintenance incident. He walked back to the surface. He had no idea. The next day was the same as the day before it, and the day after that. The mine ran. The extraction equipment ran. The supervisors sat in their station and reviewed their figures. Vrethik looked at the monthly output summary, and the numbers were good. They would keep being good. For a while. Because the signal had gone out, and somewhere in the direction of the nearest human colony, someone was going to receive it. And when they did, the figures on Vrethik's display, and the commendation on his wall, and the 3,000-year history of the Ketharan Empire, were all going to become, very suddenly, problems of a fundamentally different order. I went to work. I sorted ore. I counted the seconds of the patrol drone cycle out of habit. The way your brain continues a calculation it started long ago, even when the immediate need has passed. I sat with Suri during the break period, and we did not need to say anything. She knew. All the Thurin knew. All the Malvine and the Ashari who had learned, slowly and carefully, over months of small kindnesses, and shared information, and the kind of trust that only grows between people who have no reason to expect it. They all knew. 203 humans in a mine designed to hold livestock. Months of watching and listening and remembering. A transmitter built from ore sorting equipment by a woman who had never been asked to do anything halfway in her life. And one signal, clean and complete, carrying 8 months of information outward into the dark. We went back to work. We did not show anything on our faces that the cameras could read. We did not change our schedules or our routines or our output figures. We waited. Humans are very good at waiting. Vrethik received a message from regional administration on day 301. Callum caught enough of it to tell me the broad content. The message was a routine productivity review. Veldrath was outperforming its quarterly targets. The regional administrator commended the site for successful integration of the human population, which was apparently the topic of some discussion at the administrative level, because 3 other sites had sent similar reports. The human workers were performing above expectation, at every site. The regional administrator wanted to understand why. Vrethik replied, from what Callum could read, that the humans were a more capable labor category than initial assessment had suggested, and that with appropriate management, they could be a reliable long-term resource. He used confident language, the language of a man who was not afraid of what he did not know, because he did not know enough to be afraid. I read that and thought about Sithari, writing anomalous on her pad in the assessment facility months ago. She had been afraid. She had followed the evidence. She had tried to tell someone what she was seeing and been overruled by a supervisor who did not want to explain to the high command that the new acquisition might be more complicated than expected. The Ketharan administrative system had a structural weakness, not in its security or its infrastructure, in its hierarchy. Information traveled upward slowly, and information that made someone look bad traveled upward even more slowly. Vrethik had every incentive to tell his superiors that the humans were performing well, because performing well was a good number on his record. He had no incentive to examine the reason too carefully, because the reason was not his department. So the information went up the hierarchy looking like success. And what was actually happening did not travel upward at all. On day 312, the signal reached its destination. I did not know this at the time. I learned it later, from accounts that came back to me through channels that did not yet exist on day 312. But on that day, in a human colony, approximately 14 light-years from Veldrath, a receiving station picked up a signal on a frequency that had been registered as a standard exploration survey check-in protocol. The signal was not a check-in. The signal was 8 months of accumulated intelligence about the largest slave-trading empire in the known galaxy, transmitted in a format that any human signals analyst could read in under an hour. The colony station director, a man named Gregory Hale, read the summary report that his analyst handed him, and then read it again. He then called the United Space Exploration Force Regional Command, which called the USEF Central Command, which called the Civilian Oversight Committee, which called an emergency session that lasted 14 hours. I did not know any of this was happening. I was on level 3, sorting ore, counting drone cycles out of habit, talking to Suri during break. But something was in motion. Day 331. Callum came to me during the break period with the particular expression he wore when he had heard something that needed to be communicated carefully. He sat near me and ate his ration and said, without looking at me, "There is new traffic on the Administrative Communications channel. It is coming from above the regional level, much higher than anything I have seen before. Content? Mostly encrypted. I can only read the routing headers, but the routing is coming from Kethara Prime, from high command level." I was quiet. "It is flagged to all 12 sites simultaneously," Callum said. "The same message, whatever it is. All 12 sites, high command, the same message." Something had changed in the broader picture. Something at the top had shifted. I did not know yet whether it was the signal or whether it was something else entirely, but all 12 sites receiving a high command communication simultaneously was not routine. I passed the information through the network that night. The response came back from Site 4, from the network leader there whose name I knew only as Warwick, a surname, because that was how he had identified himself in the OR code. Warwick said, "We have seen increased administrative activity at our facility for the past week. 2 additional guard personnel added without explanation. No change in work assignments. Supervisors are tense." Site 6 said, "Equipment upgrade shipment was cancelled, without explanation. The technician who came to service our communications relay spent twice the normal time on the system. We do not know why." Site 9 said, 2 workers were taken for reassessment 2 days ago.
They were returned.
They say they were asked about our productivity rates. Specifically, who was organizing the work? Who was organizing the work? That was the question. And it was the right question, which meant someone at a level above Vrethik had looked at the productivity figures across 12 sites and asked the same question that Cithari had asked in the assessment facility 8 months ago, just from a different angle. Not what are these beings, but what are these beings doing? I spent the night in the dormitory awake, running calculations. The signal had gone out 19 days ago. If it had been received, there would be a response time, a period of assessment, mobilization, preparation, and travel. The nearest point where Yusef could stage a response was at least 12 light days away, possibly further depending on what forces were currently positioned in that sector. I did not know the timeline. I did not know if the signal had been received. I did not know if any response was coming. What I did know was that the Ketharan administrative machinery had begun to notice something was wrong with the picture it was seeing, and that once a system like the Ketharan Empire started looking for the source of an anomaly, it would eventually find it. We had time. I did not know how much. I called the network. I told them, begin the second phase. The second phase was not something we had planned in detail, because the details had to wait until the first phase was complete. The first phase had been information, connection, and the signal. The second phase was what we did while we waited, and what we did had to serve 2 purposes. It had to maintain our invisibility for as long as possible, and it had to position us to respond quickly when the situation changed. There were things we needed. The medical facility at Veldrath was minimal. Ned had been working within it as best he could for months, providing care to humans and, when possible, to the other species, in ways that did not attract supervisor attention. But the facility had resources that could be better distributed, and Ned had been building a picture of where everything was stored and how it was accessed. The equipment storage on the surface had tools and components that Gwen had been cataloging for months through the network reports from humans who passed through on maintenance details. The communications array building had, according to Tech's layout and Cora's assessment, a secondary frequency capability that the Ketharan did not actively use, but that could be accessed with the transmitter. We began to quietly move things. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would register as theft or relocation to anyone checking inventories. Small adjustments, medical supplies that were technically within normal rotation, redistributed to dormitory caches, tool components that moved from storage to maintenance areas where they would not be questioned. The transmitter, which Cora had disassembled and distributed across 11 separate pieces held by different workers on different levels, could be reassembled in under 4 minutes. And Cora spent 2 weeks teaching 3 other people, on 3 separate levels, how to reassemble it. Because if something happened to Cora, the transmitter still needed to work. On day 351, Vrethik came down to level 3 in the middle of the shift. He walked through the work area, the way he always did. But something about his movement was different. He was looking more carefully. His eyes moved over us with the concentrated attention of someone who has been told to look for something specific and is not sure what it is. He stopped near my workstation. I sorted ore. I did not look up. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked on. Behind me, Dina had watched the whole thing. During the break, she said to me, quietly, "He is looking for whoever is running this." "I know," I said. "He will not find it," she said. "Not the way he is looking." She was right. Vrethik was looking for a leader, a visible authority structure, the kind of organizational hierarchy that every other species in the Ketharan system had demonstrated when they tried to resist, a central figure around whom others clustered, a person who was different from the others in some observable way. He was looking for the head of the thing, because in his experience that was how things were organized. You found the head, and you removed it, and the thing stopped. We did not have a head. We had a network. The network did not depend on any single person. If I disappeared tomorrow, Dina would keep it running. If Dina disappeared, Owen would. If Owen disappeared, Ada would. Every critical function had been duplicated and distributed across multiple people, on multiple levels. Because I had understood from the beginning that the most dangerous point of failure in any system is the point that nothing else can replace. We were not a hierarchy. We were something the Ketharan had no category for, because the species in their system that had tried to organize had always organized the same way, clustering around a single leader, and the Ketharan had become expert at identifying and removing that leader. We had not given them a leader to remove. We had given them a system. Day 367. The message came from Site 9 first, through the network. It said, "Something is happening on the surface. Increased orbital activity. We have counted what appear to be 7 Ketharan warships entering high orbit in the past 48 hours. They are not landing. Site 6. 3 additional ships in our orbital pattern. No communication with the surface that we have detected. Site 4. From Warwick. We can see them from the upper-level ventilation points. Warships. At least 12 that we can count. They came in fast, and they are holding position." I sat with Owen in the break area, and he was doing calculations with the portable counting system he had built from uniform fasteners, arranged on a strip of fabric, flicking them across one by one, as he ran through the orbital mechanics. "If those are Ketharan warships," he said, "they are responding to something. That many ships, that fast, means High Command issued a mobilization order. That level of mobilization means they decided this was a significant threat." "To what?" Dina said. Owen looked at me. I understood what he was not saying. If the signal had been received, and if Yusef had responded, and if a human fleet was approaching Ketharan space, the Ketharan would have detected it before it arrived. They would have scrambled their military. They would have positioned forces. They would have positioned forces at the sites where their most valuable leverage was located. They were not coming to protect us. They were coming to use us. I had been waiting for this possibility, not hoping for it, not planning around it specifically, but holding it in the back of my calculations as something that might happen. If Yusef was coming, the Ketharan would try to use the slave populations as a negotiating position. They would move us, consolidate us, make us centrally located and easy to reference in whatever communication they sent. We could not allow that to happen, not because of what it would do to us, but because the moment the Ketharan tried to move us, they would lose the one advantage they had in the current situation, which was the complete ignorance of what we had built over 367 days. The moment they tried to move us, and we responded, they would know. I called the network, full network, all sites, through every channel we had. Ada and the signals team at the other sites spent 40 minutes pushing the message through every OR code relay, and every tapping pattern, and every maintenance piggyback channel we had built. The message was simple. It said, Stay visible. Stay calm. Do not let them see anything has changed. Wait for my signal. All 11 other sites confirmed. Vrethik came onto level 3 that afternoon, with 4 guards instead of his usual 2. The additional guards were carrying equipment I had not seen before, scanning equipment, the kind used for contraband detection. I sorted ore. They scanned the work area, methodically moving from station to station. One of them stopped at my station and ran the scanner along the equipment surfaces and the floor nearby. The scanner hummed. It found nothing, because everything it might have found had been distributed, disassembled, and positioned in places that a scanner looking for contraband would not reach. The guard moved on. Vrethik watched from the center of the work area. His eyes moved slowly. He was not relaxed. He was a person who had been told that something was wrong and was trying to find it with tools that had been designed for a different problem. He did not find it. He left. I finished my shift. I ate my ration. I went to the dormitory. In the quiet before sleep, I thought about Gregory Hale, reading the signal summary. I thought about 14 hours of emergency committee sessions. I thought about the Yusef fleet, wherever it was, moving through space at whatever speed the situation required. I thought about the Ketharan warships in high orbit, holding position, waiting for orders that had not yet come. I thought about 367 days of patience. And I thought about what Suri had said, in her shellplate language, on the day I had told her that when our people came, they would not leave her behind. Her plates had moved in the pattern that meant something larger than gratitude, something that encompassed all the years before, and this moment, and the long, difficult road from here to wherever here was going. I had not had a word for it then. I thought I had one now. It was the same word she had used, months earlier, when I had struggled to explain the human concept of people who are in the same difficult situation and become something more than merely together. The word was family. And in the morning, we would go back to work, and the warships would hold their orbit, and the Ketharan administrative system would look for the source of its problem in all the wrong places. And we would wait. Humans are very good at waiting. Until they are not. The morning of day 370 arrived quiet as all the others. The extraction equipment started. The light cycle changed. I sorted ore. But something was different. Not in the mine. Not in the supervisors or the guard rotations or the administrative communications that Callum was monitoring. Something was different in the way the day felt, the way the air sat in the shaft, the weight of 367 accumulated days pressing against the present moment. I had been in enough situations that were about to change to recognize the feeling. It is not dramatic. It is not a sound or a sight. It is a specific quality of stillness, like the second before a person speaks after a very long silence. The signal from Yusef came at the 44th minute of the first shift. Not to us directly, not to Veldrath. It came to the Ketharan communications array, a broad transmission on an open frequency, addressed to the High Command on Kethara Prime. Callum was at his station when it came through, and he caught enough of the routing to understand what he was hearing. He did not come to me immediately. He finished his sorting, waited for the break period, and sat down next to me with the same posture he always used when passing careful information. He said, the transmission was from a Yusef command vessel. I could not read the full content. It was partly encrypted, but the routing indicated it was a formal communication directed to High Command. The heading I could read said, Response to signal from Veldrath. I kept my eyes forward. They received it, I said. They received it, he said. I had been holding that uncertainty for 19 days, not dramatically, not with visible tension, because there was never a moment on Veldrath that I could afford to show visible tension, but I had been holding it. And now it was resolved. The signal had reached them. Yusef knew where we were. What happened next was not something I directly controlled. What happened next was in the hands of command structures and diplomatic channels, and military logistics that existed far above Veldrath's orbit. My job, at this moment, was the same job it had been for 370 days. Keep the network running. Keep the people calm. Keep the invisible thing invisible until the moment that invisibility was no longer the right tool. But the Ketharan High Command had received Yusef's transmission, and whatever was in that transmission had produced a response. That response reached Veldrath through the administrative channel in the 3rd hour of the morning shift. Callum caught the routing. He could not read the content, but the content's effect was visible within the hour, because Vrethik came down from the surface with the expression of a person who has been given an order they do not like and cannot refuse. He had new guards with him, 6 this time. He went to the center of the work area and spoke in a clear, carrying voice that the translation chips picked up across the whole level. He said, "Work is suspended. All workers are to proceed to the primary staging area at the surface. This is an administrative consolidation order." The work stopped. People looked up from their stations. I did not look up. I was already looking at Dina, across the work area. She looked back at me. I gave her no signal. Not yet. I wanted to see what consolidation meant before I made any decision. We were moved to the surface. All of us. All 9 levels. 203 humans, and the Thurin, and the Malvine, and the Oshari. Everyone in the mine. The staging area was a large open space on the surface, between the supervisor station and the equipment storage. The Ketharan guards positioned themselves around the perimeter. Above us, the brass sky of Veldrath's moon was crossed by the silent shapes of orbital vehicles, not the patrol drones Owen had tracked, but larger craft, moving in organized patterns. Vrethik stood at the front of the staging area and spoke to a communication pad, not to us. I stood in the group, and I scanned the surface layout with the accumulated knowledge of 370 days, overlaying everything I knew against what I was currently seeing. The communications array building to my left, the equipment storage to my right, the landing pad 200 meters behind the supervisor station, where a Ketharan shuttle was currently sitting with its ramp down, the northeast corner of the compound, where the relay junction was, the orbital vehicles overhead, and in the far distance, barely visible at the edge of the compound's perimeter, the horizon. Owen was next to me, he said, without moving his lips more than necessary. 6 ships visible in low orbit. 3 of them are in a descent pattern. They are coming down. Timeline? 40 minutes, maybe less. I thought about what was in orbit. Ketharan warships, responding to a Yusef communication, moving into descent pattern, which meant they were not positioning for engagement. They were positioning for retrieval. They were coming to take us somewhere else, somewhere more central, somewhere they could use us as a negotiating piece in whatever conversation was happening between High Command and Yusef. If they loaded us onto those ships, we would be scattered across the Empire in a matter of days, and the network we had built, the relationships, the shared knowledge, all of it would be broken apart and distributed and rendered useless. I had been waiting for the right moment. This was it. I looked at the network. Not literally. I looked at the people around me, the 203 humans standing in the staging area, and I knew the network was still running, still alive, because the network did not require a tapping system to function. The network was the understanding between us, built over 370 days of shared work, and shared patience, and shared purpose. Every person in that staging area knew the plan, because we had talked about this specific scenario months ago, in the quiet of dormitory nights, and the information had traveled through every level and every site in the OR code, and the tapping language, until every human on Veldrath had heard it at least twice. If the Ketharan try to move us, stop working. Not dramatically, not with confrontation. Simply stop. Put down whatever you are holding and sit down. And wait. I sat down. The staging area was a flat surface, and I sat on it the way I had sat in the assessment room when the technicians came with their calibration device. Calmly, without announcement. I simply stopped standing and started sitting. Dina sat down. Owen sat down. Callum sat. Ned sat. Gwen sat. Petra sat. And then the others sat, level by level, group by group, all 203 humans in the staging area, sitting on the ground of Veldrath's moon under a brass sky, in the shadow of a mine they had just walked out of for the last time. The Thurin did not sit, but they went still, a different kind of stillness, their shell plates folded in against their bodies in the particular configuration I had learned to recognize as a posture of deliberate non-action, waiting with intent. The Malvine stopped moving. Wide, flat hands resting at their sides, breathing audible but steady. The Oshari settled their folded wing structures carefully, and stood with the particular stillness of birds that have decided not to move. Vrethik turned from his communication pad. He looked at the staging area. He looked for a long time. Then he looked at a senior guard and made a rapid clicking sound. The translation chip gave me most of it. He was asking what had happened. The guard said he did not know. They looked at us again. There were 5 guards to 203 humans, plus several hundred other individuals, and every single one of those individuals was sitting or standing in absolute stillness, not with the stillness of fear or submission, but with the stillness of people who had decided something and were very comfortable with having decided it. One of the guards took a step toward the nearest sitting human, a woman named Iris Collins from Level 4, who had been a cartographer before the survey mission. Iris looked at the guard with complete calm and did not move. The guard stopped. Something passed through the air of the staging area. Not a sound, not a visible thing. Something in the quality of the moment, the specific configuration of who was where, and what they were doing, and what they were not doing. Vrethik put a call through to someone. From his posture and the speed of his clicking, it was not a routine call. He was reporting something he did not have words for. The orbital vehicles adjusted their descent angle. They were slowing. I waited. Vrethik ended his call and made another one. This one was longer. When he finished, he stood with his data pad in his hands and he looked at us, and I watched his eyes, the wide-set eyes that looked at 2 things at once. And for the first time since I had seen this person in the cargo hold of the transport ship, 6 months ago, I watched those eyes show something I had not seen in them before. He was not sure what to do. That was all. Not fear, not yet. Just uncertainty, arriving in a person who had not expected it. That was enough. For now. I looked at the communications array building to my left. The relay junction on the northeast corner. The transmitter, distributed across 11 people in this staging area, capable of assembly in under 4 minutes. The orbital vehicles were still slowing. We waited. Humans are very good at waiting. And the Ketharan High Command, at this particular moment, was realizing that it had a problem in its 12 slave sites, that its 3,000 years of history had not prepared it for. Not rebellion. Rebellion they knew how to handle. They had handled it before, efficiently and without difficulty, because rebellion looked like a thing they recognized. This did not look like anything they recognized. This looked like 600 individuals sitting down and looking at the sky. This looked like absolute stillness in the face of 6 guards and 3 descending warships. This looked, to any Ketharan observer with enough experience to make the comparison, very much like what Sithari had written in her report 8 months ago. Not fragile, not afraid, dangerous. Vrethik called the surface 3 times in the first 10 minutes of our sit-down. I could not hear what he was saying, only the rhythm of the calls, which told me through the translation chip fragments I caught that he was escalating. First to his immediate superior, then to someone above that, then to someone above that. The orbital vehicles had stopped their descent and were holding at a low altitude, close enough that I could see their hull markings clearly if I looked up. They were waiting for orders, just as we were. The difference was that we had already given ourselves our orders. A guard came toward the seated group, the same one who had stepped toward Iris Collins earlier. He spoke in the directive tone that every guard on every level used when they wanted workers to move. The translation chip gave me, stand, proceed to the loading area. This is an administrative order. No one moved. The guard looked around at 203 sitting humans, and several hundred still standing other species. He looked at the nearest human directly. He repeated the order. No one moved. He raised his voice. The chip gave me the elevated version of the same instruction, with a stress marker that indicated formal authority. No one moved. I was watching all of this from the inside of the group. I was not at the front. I was not at the back. I was in the middle, the same place I had been for 370 days. Not the visible center, the actual center. Callum was next to me. He said, very quietly, administrative channel, new traffic, high volume, multiple simultaneous transmissions. From where? From above, from high command, going to all 12 sites. All 12 sites. Not just Veldrath, all of them. Which meant this was not only happening here. I had sent the signal to all 11 other sites the night before, through the network, through every channel we had. I had told them what was coming, and what to do when it came. And now I was learning that the same consolidation order Vrethik had received had gone to all 12 facilities simultaneously. And at all 12 facilities, the same thing was happening. 600 people on Veldrath, multiply by 12 sites, thousands of humans, across 12 facilities in the Ketharan Empire, sitting down at the same moment and looking at the sky. Plus every other species at every site, thousands of Thurin, hundreds of Mulveen, Oshari, whatever other beings the Ketharan had collected in 3,000 years of operation. All of them had been receiving the same care and the same information and the same slow, careful extension of trust that Suri had received on Veldrath. Some of them had taken it, many of them had. The system was bigger than Veldrath. It had always been bigger than Veldrath. I had known that from the Ore Code replies, from the 8 sites that had responded. But knowing a thing intellectually and watching it become visible in the real world are different things. And as I sat on the ground and watched Vrethik make his escalating calls, I was watching it become visible. The Ketharan had built their empire on a principle. The principle was that captured species were manageable if you controlled their environment, divided them from each other, and maintained the credible authority of force. They had operated on that principle for 3,000 years, and it had never failed them. It was failing them now. Not because we had weapons, not because we had superior numbers, not because we had done anything aggressive or confrontational. We had simply sat down. We had stopped being the thing they had decided we were, compliant labor, and we had revealed, in the quietest possible way, that we had never been that thing at all. Vrethik's final call went through, and when it ended, we still for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the staging area, and stopped at the edge of the sitting group. His eyes moved from person to person, not scanning for a problem this time, looking for an answer to a question he was only beginning to understand how to ask. He said, in the carrying voice he used for announcements, "Who is in charge of this?" I waited. Other people waited. Iris Collins, from her seat at the front of the group, looked up at Vrethik and said, in the calm voice of someone who had been a cartographer and knew exactly how to read the lay of a land, "We all are." Vrethik did not have a response to that. He looked at her. He looked at the others behind her. He looked at the Thurin with their folded shell plates and the Mulveen with their wide, still hands, and the Oshari, standing like carved things at the edge of the group. He made a note on his pad. Then he stepped back and put another call through, and this one, from the duration and the complexity of the clicking, was unlike any call I had heard him make before. This one was going all the way to the top. Above us, the orbital vehicles had descended slightly. Observation range, not retrieval range. They were watching. I thought about the signal that had gone to Yusef. I thought about Gregory Hale and the 14 hours of emergency sessions. I thought about the fleet that was somewhere between here and wherever it had started. I thought about the moment when an unstoppable thing meets a foundation that will not yield, and the world has to figure out what happens next. The Ketharan High Command sent a representative to Veldrath on the afternoon of day 370. He arrived in a command shuttle, accompanied by 4 military advisors and 2 administrative officials, and he was very senior enough that Vrethik stood at the landing pad in the posture of someone who understood that their own authority had just been made completely irrelevant. The representative's name, according to the hull markings of his shuttle and the insignia on his formal administrative uniform, was a Ketharan title that the chip translated as something like High Coordinator of Acquisition Affairs. He had a gray-green face like all of them, and the wide eyes, and the 4 arms, and he walked through the staging area with the careful attention of a person who has been sent to assess a situation that his superiors have described to him in terms they did not fully understand. He walked the full perimeter of the sitting group. He looked at the Thurin. He looked at the Mulveen. He stopped for a long time in front of the section where the Oshari were standing. Then he walked to the center of the group's facing side and stood there, looking at us. I was in the middle. I was not going to him. He looked for a long time. Then he said, and the chip gave me a clean translation, "Which of you contacted the human military authority?" I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I stood. I walked through the group to the front. I stood in front of the High Coordinator, and I looked at him, and I thought about the wrist cuff on the transport ship, and the assessment room, and Suri's shell plates, and Korra's transmitter, and the tapping code through 9 levels of rock, and day 1, and day 370. "I did," I said. He looked at me with one eye and then the other. Why? It was an interesting question. He was asking it as if the answer might be something unexpected, as if he genuinely wanted to understand. I said, because we do not belong to you. Because the people in this staging area and in 11 other facilities across your empire do not belong to you. Because every being that your system has placed in a mine, or on a sorting line, or in a labor facility for 3,000 years did not belong to you, and the act of taking them was wrong in a way that does not become less wrong because you have been doing it for a long time. He was quiet. The human military is coming, I said. They received everything. The maps of every facility, the administrative records, the supply chains. Everything your system does, and everything your system is. The neutral empires in this region received a version of it as well, because the signal went to more than one frequency, and the neutral empires are now aware of what your trade routes have been carrying. His expression changed. Something behind his eyes shifted, the particular shift of a person who has just understood that the problem is much larger than the briefing said. You built this in a mine, he said. Yes. Without resources, without outside communication, without any support. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. How? He said. And this was the question that I had been thinking about for 370 days. The question that Sithari had been close to asking in the assessment room. The question that Vrethik had never thought to ask. The question that sat at the center of everything the Catharan had gotten wrong about us from the very beginning. You took a species, I said, that spent its entire history cooperating with each other to survive things that should have ended them. Ice ages, diseases, wars we made ourselves. Every time something came for us, we found each other. We shared what we knew. We kept the ones who could not keep themselves. And we came through. You put us in a mine with 200 other humans and 3 other species that needed help, and you gave us time and each other, and enough operational access to be useful. And then you stopped paying close attention because we were performing above expectations, and the numbers looked good. I paused. You built the classroom, I said. We just attended it. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the staging area, at the thousands of sitting beings, at the Thurin and the Malvine and the Oshari and the humans, at the specific quality of the stillness they were all maintaining, which was not the stillness of fear, and not the stillness of waiting to be told what to do, but the stillness of people who have already decided, and are simply letting time catch up to the decision. He said, very quietly, something that the chip translated as, "What do you want?" I thought about Suri's 30-year elder. I thought about Tech and her 4-year-old memory of a communications console. I thought about Ada, building a language through rock. I thought about Cora spending 6 months on a transmitter, never once doing it halfway. I said, end it, all of it, every site, every facility, every acquisition program, formal acknowledgement to the neutral empires, and every other government in this region. Release of every being in every facility, and then we will discuss what happens next. He was quiet. I waited. The High Command will not accept those terms, he said. It was not a refusal. It was an assessment. I know, I said. That is why I said it was the beginning of a discussion. Your High Command is going to receive a very large visit from the Yusef fleet within the next few days. When that happens, the terms will no longer be the beginning of a discussion. They will be a settlement. I let that sit. I am offering you the opportunity, I said, to be the person who began the conversation before the fleet arrived. That is a different position than the one you will be in if you wait. He looked at me. I looked back. Above us, the orbital vehicles were holding position. The brass sky of Veldrath was clear. In the staging area behind me, 203 humans were sitting on the ground, and the Thurin were still with their shell plates folded, and the Malvine had their wide hands at rest. And the Oshari were standing like carved things in the sunlight. The High Coordinator put through a call. He was on the call for a very long time. The Yusef fleet arrived in Ketharan space on day 379. I knew the exact moment it crossed the threshold, because the Ketharan communications array at Veldrath, which Cora had been monitoring since the day we reassembled her transmitter on the surface, carried a burst of high-priority traffic that went in every direction simultaneously. The Ketharan High Command had known it was coming. The High Coordinator had transmitted the summary of our conversation on Veldrath, and I had no way of knowing how his superiors had received it, but the fact that no one had tried to forcibly move us in the 9 days since suggested that the conversation had at least introduced some uncertainty into their planning. Uncertainty was useful. Uncertainty slowed things down. Slowing things down was how you bought time. Callum sat with me in the staging area on the morning of day 379 and told me what he had caught from the traffic burst. It was partial information. Incomplete, but enough. The fleet is larger than I expected, he said. From the routing headers and the response patterns I can read, the Ketharan military assets in this system are being repositioned from offensive to defensive configurations. That is a significant shift. It means whoever is commanding their response has assessed the USEF fleet size and decided not to attempt interception. They would not attempt interception, I said. The neutral empires received the signal. Yes. The Ketharan cannot fight on two fronts simultaneously, not diplomatic and military, and the neutral empires have been conducting trade with the Ketharan on the assumption that the Ketharan were operating within the acknowledged norms of the region. They were not. The signal documented that completely. I paused. The Ketharan High Command is managing the largest political crisis their empire has faced in 3,000 years. A fleet coming at them in that context is a different kind of problem than a fleet coming at them in ordinary circumstances. Callum nodded slowly. You planned for this. I hoped for it, I said. Planning requires more certainty than I had. Dina came to sit with us. She had been coordinating with the network leads at the other 11 sites, passing information through the OR code channels that were still running. She gave me the summary. At 10 of the 12 sites, the sit-down had continued without interruption. Ketharan supervisors had made attempts to resume operations, all of which had been met with the same quiet non-compliance. At 2 sites, there had been attempts at forcible resumption. Both had been abandoned when the other species at those sites had joined the sit-down, expanding the scope of the action beyond what the available guards could manage without significant escalation. The Ketharan administrative system was built for compliance. It was not built for this. Site 4, Dina said. Warwick says they have had continuous communication with a USEF diplomatic vessel for the last 48 hours. The vessel is equipped with a translator and has been relaying confirmation that the fleet is present and that formal negotiation is being initiated with the High Command. I was quiet for a moment. 48 hours of communication. The fleet was there and the diplomats were already working, which meant the USEF response had not been purely military. They had come with the full picture, the signal with all its documentation, and they had come prepared to use it. Good. That was the right approach. A military solution here would be slower and more destructive than a documented, evidenced, multi-party diplomatic one. The signal had been designed to produce exactly this kind of leverage, not just for USEF, but for every neutral empire in the region that had now received confirmation of what the Ketharan trade routes were actually carrying. The Ketharan had built 3,000 years of empire on the assumption that no one outside the system knew the full scope of it. The full scope was now public knowledge across 6 governments. They were not fighting a fleet, they were fighting a fact. That was a fight they could not win. The High Coordinator returned to Veldrath on day 381. He came with a different group this time, fewer military advisors, more administrative officials, and a person I had not seen before who carried the specific posture of someone who has been sent to make a formal communication on behalf of a higher authority. They set up a table in the staging area, an actual table, brought down from the administrative station, placed in the open space between the supervisor building and the sitting group. It was a specific gesture, and I understood what it meant. A table means a conversation between parties. The Ketharan had not set tables with slave populations before. The High Coordinator stood at one side of the table. He looked at me across the group. I stood and walked to the table. On the other side of the staging area, I heard a sound, subtle, low, the sound of several hundred Thurin shell plates moving simultaneously in the same pattern. I recognized the pattern. It was the one that meant, "We are with you." I sat at the table. The High Coordinator sat across from me. He placed his datapad on the table between us and turned it to face me. On it was a document, long, formal, with the heading that the chip translated as something close to Formal Acknowledgement and Framework for Resolution. I looked at it. Then I looked at him. "This is a beginning," I said. "Yes," he said. "The Yusef fleet will be present for the negotiation." "We have accepted that," he said. "They are already in communication with our diplomatic service." The neutral empires. Representatives are being contacted. His voice was very carefully neutral. The neutrality of someone who is managing something he did not expect to be managing, and is doing his best to do it correctly. "The other species in your facilities." He paused. "That is a larger conversation." "Yes," I said. "It is. I recommend you begin it today, not later." He looked at me. "You are negotiating on behalf of other species." "I am raising the fact that other species are involved, and that any resolution that does not address them will not be a resolution," I said. "They have representatives here, if you would like to speak with them." He looked at the Thurin section of the staging area. Suri was there. She had been there every day of the sit-down, old and patient and white-edged, her shell plates in the steady posture of someone who has waited this long and can wait a little longer. The High Coordinator looked at her for a while, then he made a note on a secondary pad. "I will arrange for communication," he said. "Good," I said. We sat at the table for 4 hours. We did not resolve everything. Resolutions of this scale do not happen in 4 hours. But we established a framework, a documented structure that acknowledged the existence of the problem and identified the parties, and created a process that had legal standing under the intergovernment accords that the Ketharan were formally party to, accords that they had been violating for 3,000 years. The framework had teeth. The neutral empires were named in it. Yusef was named in it. The species list, all the species currently in Ketharan facilities, was attached as a formal annex. At the end of the 4 hours, I asked for one thing that was not in the framework. I asked for a direct communication line to the Yusef command vessel. The High Coordinator considered this. Then he nodded. The communication line opened from the Veldrath array 20 minutes later. The voice on the other end belonged to a Yusef admiral, whose name I did not recognize, which meant she had been promoted or reassigned since I had last been current on command rosters. She said, "Commander Voss." "Admiral," I said. "We received everything," she said. "Everything you sent." "I know," I said. "I assumed you would." There was a brief pause, the kind of pause that happens when a senior officer is deciding how to say something they are not sure how to classify. "Commander," she said, "what you built out there, the network, the intelligence package, the coordination across 12 sites, 3 years in, 3 other species." Another pause. "I have been in this service for 24 years. I have never seen anything remotely like it. We had good people," I said. "You had 370 days, and a mining operation." "Yes," I said. That was enough. The formal negotiation sessions began the next day, with Yusef representatives and Ketharan High Command officials at the designated neutral point that the diplomatic teams had agreed on. They would take weeks. The full resolution would take months. The liberation of every being in every Ketharan facility would be a long, complicated, logistically enormous process. I did not worry about that. That was the kind of problem that had the right people working on it, people whose job it was, and who had the right tools. My job, on Veldrath, in these final days, was different. I spent time with Suri. We sat in the staging area, which had become a kind of living village in the days of the sit-down, with people organized into their natural groups, eating and talking and resting and, for the first time in as long as many of them could remember, not working. Not working was strange. It sat oddly on people who had spent months or years defining their existence by the rhythm of extraction equipment and sorting bins. Suri and I sat and I talked, through the vocabulary we had built over 10 months, about what came next for her people. It was a subject that carried weight, because what came next was not obvious. The Thurin who had been in Ketharan facilities for decades had, in some cases, no living memory of anything else. Their homeworld was a fact in records, not an experience. Suri's shell plates moved in a pattern I had not seen before. I looked at Callum. He listened carefully and then said, slowly, She says that her people knew their world from stories, not from memory. Stories that the elders kept, that the elders taught, in the hours when the supervisors were not listening." He paused. She says the stories are what kept them from becoming only workers. The stories kept them being Thurin. I thought about that. I thought about the human survey crew in a cargo hold, and the way we had told each other things in the dark, not because it was useful, but because talking was what we did. Because being a person means staying connected to the things that make you yourself, even when the environment is trying to reduce you to something simpler. We had stories too. We had told them to each other in the dormitory nights and the break periods, and the quiet moments between tapping code transmissions. Tell her, I said to Callum, that when this is done, when her people go home, or wherever they choose to go, those stories will have a new chapter. And the new chapter is the one where the workers sat down. Callum translated. Suri was still for a moment. Her plates moved. Callum said, she says, the chapter where the workers sat down, and the warships stopped moving, and the people who had never had a table were given a seat at one. I nodded. Yes, I said. That chapter. The Liberation transport ships arrived at Veldrath on day 391, a mixed fleet of USEF vessels and ships from two of the neutral empires that had, in the 2 weeks since the negotiation began, formally aligned themselves with the resolution process. The ships were large, built for personnel transport, configured for multiple species. I watched them land from the edge of the staging area. Ned came to stand next to me. He was quieter than usual, which for Ned meant he was thinking about something he was not sure how to say. You look like you are trying to figure out whether it is over, he said. I am trying to figure out whether it is beginning, I said. He considered that. Both, maybe. Both, I agreed. The boarding process took 2 days. The other species went first, as we had arranged, because the USEF ships had the best facilities for human biology, and the other species needed the species-specific conditions that the neutral empire ships could provide better. Suri's people went on the first day. I stood at the boarding ramp of the ship designated for the Thurin population of Veldrath, and watched the long line of them move past. Suri stopped in front of me. She looked at me with the specific attention of a person who is trying to record a moment completely. She moved her plates in the pattern that meant, remember. I touched my chest, the way I had seen her people do when they meant something was kept. Not in a record, not on a pad, inside. She moved her plates one more time, the pattern I had known since the early days, the one that Callum had translated for me, months ago, when I had struggled to explain what people become when they share something this large and this hard. Family. Yes, I said aloud, though she could not hear the word. Family. She walked up the ramp. The ship lifted on the following morning. I watched it go. We boarded our ships on the second day. I was one of the last to board, which was not something I had planned but which felt correct in the way that some things feel correct without needing a reason. I wanted to be sure everyone else was on first. I wanted to see the staging area empty before I left it. I stood on the ground of Veldrath's moon for a few minutes after the last group had boarded. The extraction equipment was still in the mine, silent now, the first time it had been silent in longer than anyone in the facility could accurately remember. The supervisor station was dark. Vrethik was gone, taken to a USEF administrative processing location, along with the other Ketharan personnel from the site. The sky was still the color of old brass. The sun was slightly too orange. The distant sound of the Liberation Fleet's engines was the only sound. I thought about 391 days. I thought about the first day, the cargo hold, the chain that was not tight enough. I thought about Cithari writing anomalous on her pad. I thought about Cora's transmitter, and Tech's 4-year-old memory, and Warwick at Site 4 saying we have been waiting. I thought about what the High Coordinator had said at the table, in a voice that had the careful neutrality of someone managing something unexpected. He had said, "You built this in a mine." Yes, I had. We had. Because that is what happens when you take a species that learned to survive by finding each other in the dark, and you put them in a mine, and you give them time, and each other, and just enough rope to build something you did not see coming. You do not get quiet compliance. You do not get livestock. You get this. I walked up the ramp of the last ship. The ramp retracted behind me. The ship lifted. Through the viewport, the moon of Veldrath fell away below, smaller and smaller, until it was a point of dark rock against the stars, and then just the stars. Somewhere in those stars, Suri's ship was moving, Somewhere, Warwick and the 41 people from Site 4 were moving. Somewhere, across 12 sites, thousands of beings were moving toward wherever their road went from here, carrying their stories and their memories, and the new chapter that had been written in a staging area on a mining moon. The road from here was long. There were negotiations still running, resolutions still being built, species still being processed out of facilities that were shutting down across the Empire. There were homeworlds to return to, and new worlds to find, and a long, complicated accounting between the Ketharan and the rest of the galaxy that would not be settled quickly. None of that was simple. But simple was not the thing I had ever been looking for. I sat in the crew section of the transport, and I looked at the stars, and I thought about what the Admiral had said, that she had never seen anything like it. The network, the intelligence package, the coordination. She had never seen anything like it. I had. I had seen it in a cargo hold, when Callum told me he read Ketharan, and I told him to tell me everything. I had seen it in a holding cell, when Owen tracked patrol drones on his own without being asked. I had seen it in a mine, when Gwen mapped a level in 2 hours from pure observation. I had seen it in the shell plates of an old Thurin woman who had kept her people's stories alive through 30 years of underground work. I had seen it in every moment when a human being looked at an impossible situation and, instead of accepting what the situation said about the limits of the possible, looked for the angle the situation had not considered. That was not special. That was not extraordinary. That was simply what we were, collected together in all our careful, observant, stubborn, cooperative, storytelling, fire-running, signal-sending, hope-against-evidence humanity. The Ketharan had wanted slaves. They had found something they did not have a name for. They had not made us into anything. They had simply, for the first time in 3,000 years, given us a reason to be fully, completely, and without apology, exactly ourselves. And that had been enough. That had been more than enough. The stars moved past the viewport, and the ship moved through them, and somewhere behind us, the Ketharan Empire was sitting with a fact about the galaxy that it had not known before, a fact that would take years to fully understand, and probably a lifetime to fully accept. The fact was simple. There are things in this universe that cannot be domesticated, not because they are monstrous, not because they are cruel, but because they are the things that looked at the end of everything 1,000 times, in 1,000 different forms, and said quietly and without drama or declaration, "Not today." That is what we are. And now the galaxy knew it.